All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Marianne, and I'm the general manager at East City Bookshop. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. Those of you here in person, those of you joining us on Zoom. Is anyone here for the first time? Excellent. Welcome. Yeah. Anyone been here before? Welcome back. Welcome. Um, Tonight's event is to celebrate Olive Days, a smoldering debut novel about a young mother in an Orthodox Jewish community of Los Angeles, whose quest for authenticity erupts in a passionate affair following a night of wife swapping. Here to discuss the book are the author, Jessica Elisheva Emerson, and Laura Hankin. If you enjoy tonight's event, you can find other upcoming events on our website, eastcitybookshop.com. You might enjoy our event with Lou Bayard on the Wilds about Oscar Wilde's family, or our event for the Forbidden Book by Sasha Lamb, a historical Jewish fantasy. A few quick housekeeping notes. If you can take a moment to silence any phones, restrooms are upstairs. If you have questions during tonight's event, you can ask them in person or using Zoom's Q&A feature. If you need a restroom, they're upstairs. Most importantly, if you need to purchase any of the books available tonight, you can do that at the register upstairs as well, or on our website. Now for introductions. In conversation tonight is Laura Hankin, the author of Happy and You Know It, A Special Place for Women, The Daydreams, and One Star Romance. Her musical comedy has been featured in publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she's developing projects for film and TV. She lives in Washington, D.C., where she once fell off a treadmill twice in one day. And the author of the evening is Jessica Elisheva Emerson. Jessica is obsessed with cooking beans, growing food, eating pie, sleeping in on Shabbat, and working toward a better world. A Tucson native, Jessica spent 22 years in Los Angeles before returning to the Sonoran Desert, where she lives with her husband and children. Her stories and poems have been published in numerous journals, and she's a produced playwright. Olive Days is her debut. Please join me in giving Jessica and Laura a warm welcome.
I was born in 1979, and if you weren't named Jessica, you were 100% named Jennifer. Laura, I was thinking of reading. Is that? Please do. Okay, I'm going to read a little. But I have a story about falling off a treadmill. Really? Yeah, and it's actually related to writing. So I'll tell it really quickly, and then I'll read. Which is that? Can you guys hear me without this? Okay. Yeah. Oh, the Zoom. I'm so sorry. I apologize. My now husband, when we were sort of dating long distance, I was on a treadmill at my gym one day, and he texted me and he was like, I found a website that I think is yours. And I knew immediately. I hadn't looked at it in like a lot of years, like 5 years. It wasn't GeoCities, but it was like It was a very old website, and I knew right away what he was talking about. And I fell off the treadmill. I was so embarrassed. I like couldn't even. I like my mind went blank, and I just it carried me backwards, and then I fell. I mean, not much, but it was embarrassing. Like I had a page of links that I liked. I mean, this is like a really long time ago. And next to them were like like links from a chain, like that. And when I had made it, in the first big internet boom, like that seemed cool.
Yeah. My first website was just like made up pets that people could adopt.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so that sounds better than what mine was. But okay. So I'm going to read a little bit, and I will tell you that so first of all, just a small crowd, but I hate going to readings. And I go to a lot because a lot of my friends are writers, and I have learned just in the past 2 weeks that that sometimes people like to hear an author read just a little bit in their own voice. And so I'm going to read. And so if you're a person like me who hates readings, it will be no more than 7 minutes. So you could know that in your head as we go into it. And if you're a person who likes it, then Mazal Tov. The only thing I think you need to know if you don't is that Shabbos is how you say Shabbat or Sabbath in Yiddish. And I don't think it's a secret that that page 1, my book opens with a wife swap in the Orthodox Jewish community. The 18th Shabbos. Like every Friday, she woke well before the family to do the dusting and wash the hard floors. Yoni always woke by 5, a leftover habit from nursing until he was nearly 3. Shosh liked to sleep later, but on Fridays, Rena woke her at 6, and together they made the challah dough. She sat Yoni on the counter, held him with one hand, and let him crack an egg and smash the yolk in his little hand, which she then promptly washed and sanitized. Rena loved to watch them together like that, Shosh on a step stool and Yoni wobbling on the counter. Shosh broke the eggs one at a time into a small bowl used only for that purpose, checked for any spots of blood, then slid each clean egg into the large wooden mixing bowl, the only treasure Rena had claimed when her grandmother died. She handed them each a piece of dough. Yoni squished and poked at his, but Shosh, not yet 5, slapped it down expertly and started folding it over itself. Preschool ended early on Fridays for Shabbos, and Rena always waited to braid and bake the chalot until Shosh got home. Weeks that she made large batches for company, most weeks, she let Shosh take the small piece of dough for the burnt offering and place it carefully in the back of the toaster oven to smolder. While the loaves baked, she let them mash old bananas to make quick bread for Shabbos breakfast, let them eat more chocolate chips than they stirred into the batter, mopped the floor again after Shosh sprayed the pans with nonstick spray and inevitably missed. These were her favorite moments of Shabbos, her only true moments of peace, the moments before Shabbos even started, and she had her children and their smiles all to herself. The rest was shrill and strenuous. From the frenzy to be ready in the moments before sunset, David rushing home in foul, the children bathed and dressed, being ready for company to arrive, or ready to walk to someone's house, leaving in time for the men to daven at shul, being sure the food was done and tomorrow's lunch put up to warm overnight, carefully choosing which soda bottles to open so that you didn't break a commandment by twisting off a top that had been stamped in such a way that opening it would break letters apart in an act that could, who knew, be like writing, thus forbidden on Shabbos. To the spilled juice, the piles of dishes, and the crumbs in every corner of the house that she just spent the day emptying so it could be filled again with the detritus of a day of rest. The sweeter Shabboses of her childhood had been all pretense, an intense fondness from her parents during the blessing of the children, the best food of the week, games, books, napping next to her grandfather on the old couch in the den. Oh, the unscheduled hours while the adults were at prayer, when her unfettered mind could burst free, free and full of electric colors and unnameable cracklings, like when she would press down hard on her eyelids, let them go, and then watch her nerves firing like it was a show. When they were guests in other homes, it was a wild freedom, reckless almost, to explore foreign rooms and foreign yards, marveling at the bookshelves and toys of others, pirating through the citrus trees that lined the tiny backyards, hiding behind pleated paper window coverings with a crayon, and daring herself to break Shabbos by making a mark. At sleepaway camp, her friends thought Shabbos afternoon was boring. They played cards and ate cold cuts and complained, but Rena exulted in the unstructured hours often spent in the orchard. A counselor had shown her both how to reach up through the bird netting to pluck the ripe apricots that had already detached, and how to smash the downy green husks of the fallen almonds so that the drupes could be peeled out whole. You couldn't pick fruit on Shabbos, but the orchard offered its gifts to her all the same. Mostly, she gathered olives. There were only 2 olive trees, but they were old and fruited madly in the early summer, and the campers were all taught how to cure olives as part of a Torah study on purity. On Shabbos afternoons, alone in the grove, she would gather the fallen ones, rolling them onto a flat path between the tree furrows, and then laying on them in her Shabbos whites. She napped on the yielding olives and hot earth with mulch in her hair, the small brown ants and garden spiders crawling over her apricot sticky hands, waking to drowsily consider the light filtering through the trees, the ripeness. She rolled around a bit before she stood, the olives like beads in a massage chair, and then went back to her tent to strip off her shirt and examine the patterns of their purple juice. She always wanted her mother to ask how it happened, those landscapes of stains, but her mother never did. They would head straight to the laundromat when she and her brother returned from camp. Her mother didn't want that much dirt in the machine at home. And her mother would cluck her tongue and say, well, they wouldn't fit next year anyway. Wash her Shabbos whites with the color load and fold them neatly. Later, they would be torn into rags. 6 summers, Rena created masterpieces on her Shabbos whites. In the later years, she was worried her mother would be able to perceive the lust in the striations until their rag bag was only strips of purplish white cotton. Her last summer in the orchard, the summer she thought her body might actually implode and shrivel to a pit if someone else didn't get inside it, she was so taken with her olive bed that she pressed a large round one into her mouth and bit through it. A lasting bitterness. Even in childhood, Shabbos had been lonely. At home, she trained in the kitchen alongside her mother, learning to shape gefilte fish loaves and braid bread and salt soup. Of course, her brother had no such training. All those hours in the orchard considering the sun, all those moments hiding behind the curtains at neighbors' homes and the tangerine trees in their yards, all those hours pretending to be asleep in the den and wishing someone would notice that she wasn't. Once, at a nearby home for Shabbos lunch, the children had been playing hide and seek and no one could find her. The adults got involved with the search, then her parents became worried. Then they began searching homes and yards up and down the street. Shabbos was nearly out by the time the host found her because he heard Rena sobbing. She'd climbed up to the very top shelf in a utility closet and stayed there for 4 hours with her arms wrapped around her knees, dedicated to the premise of the game and her sureness that if anyone really knew her, they'd know just where to look. If anyone really knew her, she deserved to be found. She supposed being busy and exhausted was better than being lonesome and bitter. This is what she told herself as she swept crumbs on her hands and knees on the 18th Shabbos after her husband had traded her. There was a thing people said, do the Jews keep Shabbos or does Shabbos keep the Jews? A foolish expression. It was she who kept Shabbos, kept it for all the Jews, kept it despite the bait and switch that happened once she was in charge of keeping it. The wives kept Shabbos, and the wives kept the Jews, the doughy, tradable wives up to their elbows in cold gray sink basins, the waxed and stretch-marked wives. In this way, it was said, this way of keeping the Jews, women earned a holiness men could never possess. So instead, the men possessed the women themselves, kept them, let them, like lumps, smolder into ash.
Well, that was a beautiful 7-minute reading.
Thank
Yeah. And, as we get into the conversation, we had talked about playing a brief game because this book is in some ways about, the lies that we tell other people and also ourselves. And so we're going to do a round of two truths and a lie about the creation of this book and the writing of this book. So Jessica will give her 3 statements and then we will try to guess which one is the lie.
Okay. So this book used to be almost twice as long, and the POV switched between the main character in the published book, Rena, and her lover, Will, and their love story takes up a piece of the book. And it went back and forth. And actually, there was a very large piece of the story about Latino culture in the historical neighborhood of Boyle Heights and Latino art in Los Angeles. That's one. 2, the wife swap scene, the whole book really happened because I heard these stories in the neighborhood, in the modern Orthodox neighborhood of Los Angeles, and I heard them over and over again, sometimes with immense detail, but I never heard the story first person. Everybody was like, my cousin this, my cousin that. It's number 2. And number 3 is that Will, and they say never to do this, but that Will was actually based on an ex-boyfriend of mine, a man I dated between my marriages. And we had a terrible breakup and he was very awful to me. But Will, look, there are some red flags, but is like basically a nice guy and a good guy. And I couldn't pick up the writing of the book again for a little while because I was so angry with this man. And so the character that I had been writing.
I also love how detailed all 3 of these things are. I'm like, you can tell you're a writer because even your lie is very detailed. All right. So clap if you think that number 1, the dual POV, is the lie. Clap if you think that number 2, hearing this anecdote about wife swapping, is the lie. All right, we got 2. And clap if you think that being angry at an ex-boyfriend is the lie.
So I had dinner with some of these people. So I know that's true. That is not true. Although I will say that I did have an ex-husband who was angry. An ex-husband. No, my ex-husband is actually delightful. An ex-boyfriend who was very angry with me for writing the book, which is a narcissistic thing to. But I didn't base any characters on real people.
Okay. So which one is the lie?
The 3. Number 3 was the lie.
Got it. Okay. Yes. I feel like this game actually always confuses me.
Yeah, no, it's very confusing.
So then you were walking around the neighborhood and hearing these anecdotes about wife swaps happening.
Yeah. So not like within, I in my head, it's like within a week of moving to this neighborhood, but maybe in reality, it was a little longer. Somebody, actually a young man, an unmarried friend of mine, so it really wasn't his story, as the first one to tell me. And he said, like, do you know that I've heard that there are wife swaps in the community? And I was like, go on. And he told me what he knew. And I said, is there anybody that I could take to like coffee or lunch to talk about this? And he said, like, why? And I said, because I'm a writer. And so I did have some coffees and some lunches. And it is true that several people told me stories and that nobody told it in first person. Although I really like, after some of them, you'd be like, wow, you're so much closer to your cousins than I am. They told you so many details about like a key party. But I was never like that. Was you. So yeah, and I don't think it's endemic, like at all. I don't think it's common to the community. I think it's unique, and I think that it's a thing that happens. And one of the interesting things for me, in writing this book, it took me a long time to write this book. I was raising 3 children and working. It took me almost a decade to write and edit it. And in that decade was like the ascendancy of polyamory as a cultural phenomenon, which we could talk about more, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I took a question, but that happened while I was writing this book. And so it was interesting for me to have a process where when I started writing the book, people maybe knew what a key party was, but they didn't have friends who were in thruples. And now really people do.
Well, and you timed this very well in that I think that new Mormon show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, just came out and they all were swapping. Well, but so it's interesting because I feel like this idea of the swap in this community is such a great hook and it's such a wonderful opener to the book. But then the book actually goes in some unexpected places. And it's really more of an inciting incident than like the structure around which the book is hung. And did you always know that that was going to be the balance, or did that just arise more naturally as you were writing it?
No, I didn't know. But what I did know was that so right away when I heard this story, I was like, well, that is a story, but it's not a novel, right? Like that's it. Just it's an anecdote, and so it's not a novel. And for a while, I was actually writing a story, and I count this in the decade. I was writing a story about like a love triangle between a woman and her husband who she loved and like the man that she slept with at this thing that he wanted her to go to. And it wasn't that interesting. I really struggled with it for a while, and it just for me wasn't that interesting of a story. So I did always have this opening as a backdrop. And what really became interesting to me was I actually don't feel judgy at all about what consenting adults do in bedrooms. And I would think that for some people, this could be something that puts a spark in a marriage or helps or in some way. But I was most interested in a character for whom it didn't work. And I really wondered about a character from this particular community. And again, I could see it go both like going both ways. I could see somebody being sort of liberated by it, but I was interested in a character that felt really confined by it and that maybe didn't even have a technology to process this particular kind of guilt based on how they were raised.
Yeah, because there's certainly no like, okay, we swapped and now let's talk about it.
No, there's no let's talk about it.
Yeah.
A couple times she tries really, and her husband is not interested in talking about it.
No.
Right.
But despite this particular act not working for her, there is a lot of lust in the book. And I think you parallel in such an interesting way this idea of lust and religious devotion, having these similarities in the way that they can change the way that you see yourself and the world around you, and you feel a part of something bigger. And I'm curious as to what drew you to juxtaposing these two.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, I do think that like religious fervor and lust, I guess fervor is what's in common there. But I think there are some commonalities between extraordinarily motivating outside influences on your life. But I also think that Rena sets up what I think is a false dichotomy between duty and desire. And you'll see the reviews. I've been lucky to have some nice reviews pick up on this a lot, and they'll often say like it's this battle between duty and desire. But I actually don't think that that's true. I think that that's how my character sets it up for herself. So I could imagine other women in her same community living actually a fulfilled life and being able to like self-actualize desire and also fulfill the duties, right? It's not like a judgment call. I do have judgments on sort of lives that women lead in all sorts of ways, but it's not a judgment call in the community. But I do think that for Rena, she sets it up for herself. Like she can't have both. And that is what puts her on, like you could say a spiral, because right after the wife swap, this is not a spoiler, she has an affair with like a very Orthodox rabbi, much more religious than she is. And then while she's in the midst of that, falls in love with an art teacher from outside of the community. He's a Latino American art teacher from a community college, and then it's really their love story.
Mm.
And there are, I mean, my husband said, and I don't think this is a bridge too far for my son who's here, but my husband said, like, look, like there are a lot of boners in this book. And I misquoted him once. I said, you know, my husband says there are too many boners in this book. And my husband was like, I didn't say too many. I just said a lot.
Maybe a lot is the perfect amount of boners to have in a book.
Yeah.
All right, to switch it away from that for your son's sake. um, you know, I'm curious as to what sort of research you had to do to write about this community.
That's a great, actually, nobody has asked me that question yet. And maybe because I've mostly been in conversation with rabbis who are like, so what role does God play?
Side note, I do want to say thank you for allowing me to be in conversation, even though I am not a rabbi.
This is a great delight. Actually, there is, like, when I was looking at my lineup, I was like, there actually might be a problem here. It's just, I used to train rabbis for a living, so I'm friendly with many of them. But this is actually great. And it's a great question, because a lot of the research that I did, so I'm not a modern Orthodox Jew. And there's like some evidence for that. But I lived in a community in Los Angeles that was really post-denominational. And so I had neighbors who were all sorts of on the Jewish spectrum, and particularly modern Orthodox neighbors and friends, and even family members through my ex-husbands. And I learned from them traditions and rituals. I learned recipes. When we lived in LA, we were often Shabbat walkers. We would walk to Shabbat, even though I would drive on Shabbat. We often walked to synagogue. And so, and it was a post-denominational synagogue where I was in a space with people where it was the only Jewish thing that they did was come to this space, and with modern Orthodox people. And so just living in Los Angeles was a lot of the research. But there were some things as I wrote that I had to research, and particularly where I had to check myself. Like I thought that I was using a word correctly, but I needed to check myself. And often that wasn't internet research. So I was like reaching out to people. And I have a dear friend who's a linguist. I actually had the book read. They call them sort of sensitivity readers now in the other part of the world that I work. I work in nonprofit literacy. But I thought of them more like as linguistic reads. And I had a Jewish linguistics professor and actually a couple of Mexican American Chicano educators read the book, because I was very concerned about some of and in the first draft there was a lot more Spanish. And so some of the research happened in that way, really like checking my assumptions. There wasn't research, and there wasn't like a lot of Googling,
right.
you know?
Right. Yeah. And you could only get so much from those copies where people were telling.
No, I did have to invent some of the details, but I'm super pleased with what I landed on.
Yeah. I mean, me too. I very much enjoyed this book. I'm curious too about setting in terms of time and place. You know, the majority of the book is set around 2012, and I wondered, you know, why then versus now, and then as well, like the particular neighborhood in Los Angeles where you set it.
So that's a really good question. So, I mean, part of the truth is when I started writing the book, but I actually at one point did a big rewrite that was unsuccessful because I wanted it to be set in more contemporary times. It's not so old. And this is really the truth. I didn't feel equipped to write a book that happened during a Trump presidency. I thought it would have to be acknowledged, and I thought it would take away from the rest of the story. And so when I tried to bring it up to date, up to speed, and there are actually some political references because Obama has been elected, and like one of the things that's happening in the modern Orthodox community is that at least in Marina's circle, they feel super pleased about that. They feel like they could elect a Black president, and they have computers in their pockets. And there's one line that was a little bit heartbreaking to write. Israel Palestine is not a theme in this book. This is an American Jewish book, but one of the things she thinks is and there will be a peaceful two-state like solution. And as I was just glancing through the book last week, I found it to be like particularly heartbreaking, but all of these hopeful things that exist. And it was important to me as a setting that she was in a place of hopefulness in the world. And I really think that the Obama election and this idea that Obama's going to be reelected is important to like the vibrancy that's happening in her culture and the other things that are going on. Her husband, actually, this just came up this week pretty prominently in New York. Her husband, who's not like a great guy, he hasn't come off great in the book, but he has a really good issue, which is that he is working on the plight of Jewish women whose husbands will not grant them a Jewish divorce. And they're called like agunot, chained women. And her husband believes that it's a totally unfair system and that they have to change it through advocacy. And she agrees that it's a bad system and she thinks it should be like left to the rabbis. And she has a bit of an evolution. It's a tiny subplot of the book, but last week there was like a very prominent Aguna in New York who finally got her get. And because of women's advocacy and because all of these women went on a sex strike, actually for 6 months, these Orthodox women went on a sex strike and eventually and so we could diagnose all sorts of things about why that worked and like actually who really had to put their desire on hold. But these women are heroes. And so I think that it's important. So like her husband is very hopeful though. It's all this thing of like, we can change whatever we want to change. And I would have lost all of that if I said it during a Trump presidency or right after in the wake.
Right. During COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it is wild to try to write books set in the present right now and just be like, anything could change at any time.
Right. The book I'm writing now is set in the present. And for many reasons, I hope that we're just like, okay. It's not because I'm writing a book, but
yeah.
But also that.
It's okay to be a little bit selfish about your writing.
So my third novel is actually just set in an alternative present. I feel like I've cracked the nut.
I
can't do that again. So
yeah, I thought about doing that for one of my books of just like not acknowledging the pandemic, not acknowledging anything. I was like, oh no, that's not gonna work.
Well, once I did it though, it opened. I mean, this is not really about olive days, but I'll like in my third book, and I'm working on the second, but I know what the third is. Like the workers won in the 60s. And what the whole world is different, and it's super fun to write. I love it. Love it.
I'm excited to read that one. Well, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you developed Rena, who is this protagonist who just feels so unlike most other protagonists I've read. She's full of these like very interesting contradictions. She follows the rules of her community, but she is also an atheist, and so many other things. So yes, take it away.
Okay. So Rena, we were talking about Philip Roth in a different context at dinner, but you said who is unlike other things. And actually that's interesting because one of the things that you'll see, I know you're not supposed to read Goodreads reviews, but one of the things that you'll see is that some people find Rena to be unlikable. Some people, in fact, find every character in the book to be unlikable, which I at least feel like is a level playing field. But some people find Rena to be unlikable, and my question always back to those people would be like, do you find all of Philip Roth's male characters to be unlikable, or is that cool with you? And is that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, I am unconcerned with if my women characters are likable. That it doesn't concern me in the slightest. What concerns me is, are they real? And I'm not, of course, the only woman doing this. There are scores and scores of women who are writing beautiful stories where women are self-actualized and have a sense of agency. But sometimes I get this feeling that like then the broader world thinks like, all right, we've done it now. Like that'll do. Or like that's enough. And I think we could have, centuries more of self-actualized women. Like I think all of the books should be self-actualized women until we've reached a point where there is some equity. So first of all, I'm interested in women who are real and have real struggles and who have interior lives that are not known. Another thing that I think is important about Rena is that she doesn't have a lot of women friends. And I think that our culture sells friendships between women pretty hard. And I think friendships are super important between women. And I don't think that everybody has them. And I think particularly in some cultural places, there are fewer, you know, Rena has a lot of relationships with other women. She sees them all the time. They're always at other people's homes and other people, but like she doesn't really have friendships. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then what would it mean for a woman in that position? And then what would men who come into her life mean? And how would she be impacted by not having close friendships with women? So I didn't need her to be likable. I wanted her to feel very real to me. I felt that there could be women who are like isolated in situations like this. And then so people have been saying to me recently, like, it's a coming of age story, but she's 30. And I think that that's true actually, but also I'm like, well, then is every book a coming of age story? Um, it's just like a story. Um, but I was really interested and actually if you read the book, and I don't think this is a spoiler, it's like not her first go round with desire. She went to college and had like some experiences, but then she got married and just sort of like put that piece of her to sleep. And so that was another thing that I was really interested in, like what happens when desire is awakened. It's sort of in a non-optimal situation, and how might a person act on it. So those are the ways it came together. And the atheism, actually, I have a piece coming out in Lilith magazine, maybe next week, maybe the week after. I'm an atheist, and there are very few parts of the book that come directly from my life. But my husband and I are both committed atheists and committed Jews. And sometimes people will say to us, like, I think you mean agnostic, which is such a weird thing to say to somebody, like sort of demeaning.
Have you considered that the entire way you
Right.
self-identify is incorrect?
And we'll be like, no. And so I just really wanted to write about that. It's confusing to people. I think it's confusing to non-Jews. There are internal issues with this in Judaism too. Like, what happens to somebody who becomes a Jew by choice? Do they have the same privileges as a Jew who's born into Judaism? And actually, there's no requirement to believe anything in order to be Jewish. So there are some internal anomalies, but I really wanted to write about this. Like, what does it mean to have ritual and observance at the center of your life, but not be doing it because you're directed by a higher power? And my suspicion is not, again, that it's endemic, but that this is actually something a lot of people can probably relate to.
I'm sure it is, but it also never feels preachy.
Hopefully not.
Yes.
I know enough rabbis.
Well, I have plenty more questions to ask you, but I don't know if we should be opening it up to audience questions soon to give the opportunity, if anybody has one.
Sure, and it could be anything because the book just came out like 2 seconds ago. So you don't have to have read the book to have a question. It's a small group, so I'm happy you have a question.
Just to repeat for the Zoom audience, into the microphone, since you took about a decade to write the book, what was your writing process like, especially because you were juggling so much?
Yeah. I love this question because I think it's really different. So you hear a lot of, I feel so ill-equipped to give writing advice, but you hear a lot of advice like a writer just writes and they write every day and that's what it means. Or, you'll hear working parents who very successfully get up like at 4 a.m. before their families and work. And that is not, none of those things I can relate to. And the main way that I wrote this book, and it's not, by the way, at all the way I'm writing my book now, but this is my oldest son, Noam, and I have another son who's almost 2 years younger, and I have a 7-year-old. But long before I had the 7-year-old, my ex-husband and I got divorced, and every other weekend I didn't have my children. And I would take many times a year, I would take a day off of work and take a 3-day weekend and go up the coast to this beautiful town. I don't mind saying it here because nobody can go there. Like in California, I never want to tell people my secret because I don't want it to be like everybody goes there. This town of Cambria, and I would take the cheapest motel room I could. And it's such a pleasure to go there now when I have like a little more money and I can like pass by the motels I used to stay at. But I couldn't even afford like an ocean view, and this town is all ocean. I would just open the window and like hear it. And I would go, and for 3 days, all I would do, I would take a walk in the morning and a walk in the evening. I would like eat peanut butter off a spoon. I did a lot of drinking, I'm sorry to say, of like it's not very nice. We would call it like hobo sangria. Red wine and Diet Coke, like a lot of that. My teeth are still not the same. And I would write or edit 8 or 9 hours a day. And that's how I got a lot of it done. And some of the writing and editing happened obviously in between that. You can't, I couldn't do the whole book that way, but like the bulk of the work happened in that way. And it wasn't until I signed with an agent and I was doing a rewrite for the agents and then a rewrite for the publishers that I really wrote in my home significantly. It's very motivating to sell a first book. And I also don't have any children. I mean, my 7-year-old is at home, but he's like, I don't have a toddler anymore. And so until about 3 weeks ago, when book stuff started ramping up, I was writing every night pages. And so now I write in a much more typical way. But the way that this book happened was really on peanut butter and ocean.
It is funny. I feel like people say, oh, once you have a kid, you will just get so much better at being efficient about writing. You'll be able to write a scene in 10 minutes during their nap time. No, I have not found that to be true. And I very much feel the same way as you of like the good writing happens when you can turn off everything else in your life and be like, okay, now I am alone.
I also do wonder if it was if it was born out of sadness. So a secret that I have talked about with other divorced parents is that you actually grow to really value these weekends without your kids, and probably when they get old enough, your kids might grow to value some time without you too. But that wasn't the case in the beginning. It was very sad. It was very, very sad. And I found it very hard to just be home in the place that I lived and where my children's like voices should have been, and they weren't. And so it may have started as sort of like, I got to get out of here. And what do I do? Well, I write because I'm working on this book and because I'm a writer. And then I was sort of hooked on it. Yeah.
Makes sense. Oh, yes. Art is an important theme in the book. So what was the cover design process like?
Great. And you all have it in front of you, and specifically watercolor. So Will teaches a watercolor class. It's not his medium. This man who she falls in love with, he's an oil painter, but he's like taking it over for somebody at this community college where but basically what happens is Rena is super unhappy after this wife swap, and her husband is like, you used to have your art in college, like go take an art class. And eventually it just seems easier for her to take it than she doesn't really want to. And she meets Will, and he's teaching this watercolor class, and she falls in love with him. And she does have this sort of repressed creative. She's a very creative person, and it's been repressed. And so the cover design process was amazing. My publishers, first of all, they were also amazing with the title. I had been working with a title for 10 years that I knew would never be published, and I just don't even really like doing titles. So the title I had been working with was it was bad, you guys. It was bad. It was called From the Verb to Know. Like you might read it in a dictionary entry, like after like the From the Verb to Know. And we kept like that piece of the book where it came from. And so when I sold it, my publisher said like, we're gonna need a new title. And I was like, I know. And they were like, why don't you come up with a list of 10 titles? And I said, why don't you? And they said, well, that's not how we like to work. We think of ourselves as a very author friendly press, and they have been. Counterpoint Press, soup to nuts, absolutely amazing. And so for the titles, my editor said, okay, how about if we both come up with lists? And Olive Days was sort of a version of Olive Days was on both lists. So that seemed amazing. And then we didn't realize until later that it looks great in print, and it's kind of hard to say out loud. People will be like, what's your book called? And I say Olive Days, and they'll be like, all of the days. I'll be like, no, like the fruit. So the cover though, I didn't have to really do anything. I don't know if you've had this experience, but they ask you to put together a whole questionnaire when you sold a book, and they ask like covers of books I've loved in the last few years. And what do I think the cover should be? And could I send some reference art? And none of the work I did, I take no credit. Then I think the artist was like, okay. And made a much better thing. But it was great because they gave me a version of this right away, and they gave me a few different color schemes, and I liked the yellow the best, and they gave me a few different options. Like one of them had one olive, but listen, the central piece of it was always the same. Like her life is going splat while she takes a watercolor class, and I think it's quite beautiful. And the only change I made, other than picking like my favorite versions, was that the olives didn't have these little pit holes on them, I guess you would call them. And I thought they looked like plums. And although the olives were talking about falling off a tree, of course, would not be pitted, I felt like it wouldn't read like an olive, even with the word olive. And that was the only change I made. And they made it right away. They it was just delightful. Yeah, they gave me a bunch of different fonts. I was able to work with that. So that's how it came about. It was just the brilliance of, her name is Nicole Caputo, who designed my cover, and it came to me almost in that form.
That's amazing because I feel like it's not always that way.
No, I feel super lucky, and also lucky about the title. It just happens that I don't want to think of it like I would let, but many authors would really want a publisher to say, why don't you give us options? It's your story. I just happen to hate titles.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah.
I've never stuck with my original
Yeah.
title. Oh, except for my book, The Daydreams. But we spent a whole like month trying to come up with better titles, and then we were like, oh, let's just go back to The Daydreams.
Yeah.
Uh,
Was there another Zoom question?
oh, what a good question. If you could,
You want to repeat it?
yes.
Okay.
If you could pick the perfect setting for reading the book, location, snacks, vibe, what would it be?
I've never had this question before. Like, huge props to the question asker. Um, I listen, I'm like a daughter of the West. I write books set in the West. It's not a Western. You might, or maybe it is. But I'm interested in like the idea of the frontier and manifest destiny and open spaces. So I would think that the West would be a very good place to read it. And pending that, a city for sure. This is like a city book. So some books you might want to take to the beach. This book I would read in the city. And as far as food goes, that's really hard because there's a lot of food in the book, like a ton of food. And you can go, I have a page on my website for book clubs that have like menus from the book. And it was not hard because she cooks all the time. So I just lifted it right from. And I have to tell you, this is probably not what the question asker is looking for, but there's a scene like 2/3 of the way into the book, when she finally breaks the laws of kashrut, of kosher, for the first time in her life. And it's like, it's revolting. It's a disgusting scene. She goes, and she's not like eating bacon. She's just like eating foods that she wasn't allowed to eat as a child because it didn't have a hechsher, a kosher marking on it. So really she has this obsession with SpaghettiOs. Her whole life she couldn't eat SpaghettiOs, but she just goes and like spray cheese, and she gets very sick. And even though she's an atheist, I think she has a moment where she's like, like, because she gets so sick from eating this non-kosher food. And I can't really recommend it, but I do have a list on my website of all the foods she eats on that binge. But alternatively, I also offer like a really beautiful challah recipe.
It just depends on what kind of reading experience you want.
It depends on the reading experience.
Do you want to be kind to yourself or not?
Yeah. Yeah, Lauren.
You know a lot of foods. So I'm wondering, like, how would you go about writing this in a community where everyone has so many opinions about what's the right way to be Jewish, and how did you address that? I'm sure.
Yeah, that's a great question.
How did you go about writing this? How did you go about writing this in a community where everybody has a lot of opinions?
Well, first of all, I don't live there anymore. And that's helpful. And I actually hadn't lived in the Pico Robertson neighborhood for a while, although okay, I'm going to tell like a brief story about my week in Pico Robertson last week when I went back in a minute. But here's my assumption. So first of all, I really have tried to balance also the beauty of the community. I think there's a lot of beauty in ritual, and I think there are a lot of problems with this kind of life. And I don't mean that in a judgy way. I think all lives have problems, and I think that this is not an exception. So I tried to balance also what I think is the beauty. But my main prevailing assumption is that all types of Jews, including modern Orthodox Jews, have many better things to think about than me or my story. They live a life devoted to God or devoted to purpose, if not God, and they're very confident in that identity. And me writing a book can't sort of, I think, dent that. Um, in the Jewish community, there's a saying, so there's this idea Lashon Hara, which people sometimes understand to be gossip, but actually Lashon Hara means speaking about somebody not in their presence. It doesn't actually even have to be that gossipy. And so in some communities, you'll see, like in the bakeries in the neighborhood that this is set, you'll see signs that say like no Lashon Hara. Or sometimes you'll see campaigns in a community that's like says basically like Lashon Hara, don't tell it to me. And I have a really good friend of mine, and we're always like, tell it to me. um, but I don't, I haven't experienced yet any sort of blowback. That doesn't mean, I just assume people who would be angry about it aren't reading the book. And that's fine. But I have received several emails from people who either still live in the community or are used to, who have been very grateful, or alternatively who've just not expressed gratitude, but like seen a piece of themselves in some part of the story. And that's why I think stories are very important. And there are lots of other stories that could be told about the modern Orthodox world. So I'm not I'm not so worried, but like ask me again next week. Maybe somebody will have yelled at me and I'll feel more worried. But here's my story about Pico Robertson. By the way, Lauren was not one of my students, a student when I was the director of a Jewish center at the University of Arizona. And actually, my students, I was almost done with this process, but you'd be surprised what a formative experience that was, and how in some of the editing, it impacted me to have worked with young Jews from all stripes. It was, yeah, yeah. But I was still doing some edits, right? And just it was impactful. But when I went back to Pico Robertson last week, I had a big LA launch last week, and one of the things I wanted to do was serve slivovitz, which is a very pungent plum brandy, and Rena makes it in the book. And so I wanted to do that, and I also had like custom cookies made. And so I went to like a fancy kosher liquor store in the neighborhood. It was like my first stop after I came from the airport, and I went in, and it was an 80-year-old man named Saul running the shop for his son. And I asked for 2 bottles of Slivovitz, and he said, and I wasn't looking, sometimes I go in looking to talk about myself. I wasn't looking to talk about myself. And he goes, but like, why would anybody need 2 bottles of Slivovitz? He's like dusting them off, you know? And so I told him why. And he goes, oh, well, what's the name of your book? And I said, Olive Days. And he goes, I've heard of it. And I said, I don't think so. I said, it came out today. Like, this is the day it comes out. It's published today, but that's very kind of you. And he was like, no, my wife and I read out loud to each other, or was it reviewed in the Jewish Journal last week? And I said, like, yes. And he said, and it was a very good review. And I said, yes. And he said, my wife and I read, and then he was like, I got to get a selfie. And he called his wife, and he's like, you'll never believe who's in my liquor store right now. And I was like, I'm famous. And that was the last time that happened to me on that whole trip, that anybody was interested at all. But I couldn't, but like, I literally had come from the airport. And so Saul is I really love Saul, and that made me feel a little bit at ease about the Jewish community that I was writing about.
Oh my God, you got to dedicate your next book to him.
I believe me, Saul's going to be in there.
Yes. Well, do we have time for one more question? If no one has one, I can ask him. Oh yeah. Yes. What writers have been your largest influence, and what books do you see this book in conversation with?
are my aunt and uncle on the Zoom? I feel like my aunt and uncle might be on the Zoom. Hi guys. My uncle had a procedure today, so he couldn't be here. And so, but I feel like they're maybe on the Zoom. Whoever's question that was, it's a great question. So look, I read like widely and deeply, although not when I'm writing first drafts. And it would be like foolish to say that Chaim Potok didn't have a huge influence on my life. And he is not a household name anymore, but he was. He was an extremely popular author among Jews and non-Jews. Alike. And he actually is the last person who really set a lot of stories in the modern Orthodox community, although he wouldn't have even really called it that way or referred to it that way in his books. But he wrote this very famous book, The Chosen and The Promise and The Gift of Asher Love. And he has a huge body of work. And so those books really impacted me. I read them as a child, and then I read them again later on. I think Nicole Krauss had a huge impact on me, particularly her first book, The History of Love, which is like extremely aspirational. Um, there's a writer's writer named John Williams, who's not the John Williams you're thinking of, who wrote The Emperor's March and all the other movie music, you know. And the book is called Stoner, and that's also not what you're thinking of. It's about an old-timey college professor whose last name is Stoner, and it's like one of these writers books. Like if you go get your MFA, like everybody's talking about 3 books, and Stoner is one of them. But it's so good. It's not hoity-toity at all. And if there's any John Williams in this very bookshop, you should buy it. He has another book called Butcher's Crossing. Amazing, and for me, like the great American novel and the kind of thing that I can reread all of the time. And then there's like a whole body of adultery books that I immersed pretty heavily in at times when I was writing this book. We Don't Live Here Anymore comes to mind most immediately. And in terms of books that I think that this is in conversation with, I actually don't think about that too much, but when you are trying to sell a book, they often have you write like a sentence about comps, like this meets that. And I did that, and I never thought it would last. And my publisher is still using it. And I'm not even sure if it's totally accurate. And it's not even about 2 books. It sort of said like, this is like Stiesel, which is it was a Netflix show. It is a Netflix show set in a very Orthodox community, meets The End of the Affair, which is a very old book. I didn't maybe do like a great job of making it super palatable. But my publisher seemed to like it. And so I guess that is my answer to that piece of it. But my hope also is that it's in conversation with all sorts of stories by women in particular who are setting stories and characters in communities and women who maybe seem invisible to the world, or who, unless you read a story about them, they're not really on your mind, or you see them in passing, but you don't really imagine the fullness of their lives. And there are a lot of women doing that work, but I never know how to say. I think it's Callie Fajardo on Stein. She wrote Sabrina and Karina and Woman of Light, but particularly Sabrina and Karina, or Karina and Sabrina. I can never remember the order of her title. Is a book of short stories. She's an indigenous Latina woman. It's set in the American West, mostly in Colorado, and it's stunning. And I'm a big evangelizer for the book. I talk about it everywhere I go, and I would like to think that my story is in conversation with other women's writing like that about women who you maybe don't think of.
Well, this book certainly made me think of this woman, and I will be thinking about her for a long time. And I hope that if people haven't read it yet, that they love it as much as I did. And it was so great to get to talk to you about
Thank
this.
you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And nice to meet you. Our families, you're like family to my family, but we've never met until this day. So.
Right. We're basically like unofficial second cousins.
That's how I like to think about it.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. And thank you guys for coming out on a weeknight. I appreciate it.
Right. Thank you so much to Laura and Jessica for being here tonight. We couldn't be more delighted. Thank you all for being here in person and on Zoom. We're going to transition to a signing. So we'll step away for a minute. If you want to help us out by folding up your chairs and just putting it against this wall, we'll put them away. And you can meet right back about here in a couple minutes. Most importantly, again, books are available for purchase upstairs and on our website. And let's give one more round of applause for Jessica.